When you enter the Sophia stage, letting go is no longer a choice. You notice it first in a moment so small that no one else would think to call it a turning point. A message arrives, and your hand does not move. The screen lights, the name appears. The familiar current that once ran through your chest does not come. No tightening, no anticipatory guilt, no immediate rehearsal of tone, no instinctive drafting of a careful answer that protects the other person from themselves and protects you from their reaction. The silence is not discipline. It is not restraint. It is not a decision. It is an absence of the old compulsion. And because the outer event is so ordinary, because it is only a delayed reply, because it is only your face remaining unchanged where it once would have softened, neither you nor anyone around you can at first recognize the scale of what has happened. Yet, this is often how a deep psychic event announces itself, not as thunder, but as the failure of an old reflex. You may still call it exhaustion. You may still say, in the language available to consciousness, that you are tired, that you cannot explain, that you need space, that something in you has gone quiet. But what has gone quiet is not life. It is a particular arrangement, a hidden arrangement, a contract that once governed your relationships from beneath speech. The contract said your role is to remain readable, your duty is to remain emotionally available, morally reachable, and inwardly interruptible. Your task is to keep the doors open even when no one enters with care. For a long time, this contract did not feel like a contract. It felt like goodness, it felt like love, it felt like conscience, it felt like being the one who understands. Now, something has altered so completely that the old entrances no longer lead where they once led. They still knock, they still use the old keys, but the rooms are not arranged as before. This is why, when you enter what I would call the Sophia stage, letting go is no longer a choice, not because you have become hard, not because you have chosen indifference, not because you are performing detachment as a new identity. It is no longer a choice because the psyche has already withdrawn belief from what it once served. A thing can be renounced while still loved, and then there is struggle. But when the inner structure that sustained the attachment collapses, the hand opens before the mind forms a sentence. One experiences this as inevitability, and those around you experience it as refusal. You will see this most clearly not in your thoughts, but in the reactions of others. They begin to move around you in strange patterns. Someone becomes suddenly warm, but the warmth carries pressure. Someone else becomes cold, but the coldness is theatrical, as though waiting for you to restore the old emotional weather. A person who once ignored your boundaries becomes unexpectedly concerned with your well-being. Another begins to speak to you with exaggerated politeness, as if you have become dangerous and must be handled through formality. Someone asks if you are angry. Someone asks if you are depressed. Someone asks what happened to you. Someone accuses you of becoming selfish, distant, arrogant, ungrateful, unrecognizable. These are not random responses. They are attempts to test whether the former passages into you still exist. The psyche of the other, when it has unconsciously relied on your openness, cannot immediately interpret your new condition. It reads the absence of access as hostility because it does not yet understand that what has changed is not your opinion of them, but the architecture of your inner house. A person can tolerate your pain because pain remains legible. They can tolerate your pleading because pleading confirms the old relation. They can tolerate your anger because anger still binds, but they become disoriented by your non-participation when it is not theatrical and not punitive. They do not know where to place themselves when your silence is not a strategy. This is where one must speak carefully. There is a vulgar way of describing such a condition, as if your withdrawal were a weapon and others were simply weak. That is not what I mean. The psychology here is more exact and therefore more severe. What collapses around you is not merely influence, it is a pattern of projection and compensation in which your emotional labor once stabilized the undeveloped parts of others. If you carried the atmosphere of the relationship, if you absorbed confusion and returned clarity, if you translated cruelty into woundedness and gave it back as understanding, if you turned every injury into an occasion for introspection and repair, then you were not only participating in a bond, you were unconsciously functioning as a regulatory organ within another person's psychic economy. When that function ceases, they feel not only abandoned, but internally exposed. You may have already seen this in small scenes that would once have drawn you into immediate repair. A family member speaks sharply and waits. You do not correct the tone, but you do not submit to it either. You answer the content, not the emotional hook. They repeat themselves louder. You remain in the same register. A friend tells you, with a note of accusation, that you have changed. In earlier years, you would have explained your history, your fatigue, your intent, your love, your confusion, your reasons. Now you hear the sentence and recognize it as an announcement of disorientation on their side. You do not rush to make it easier for them, not because you wish to wound, but because the inner mechanism that once translated every accusation into self-review has become inactive. A partner produces urgency where no urgency exists. The old fear does not rise. You watch the urgency move through the room like weather that can no longer enter the walls. This is a difficult thing for consciousness to accept about itself, because the ego prefers to think in decisions. It prefers to say, I set a boundary, I chose distance, I finally learned. But what is occurring in the Sophia stage is not primarily an egoic improvement. It is an event of reorganization around a deeper center. The ego experiences the aftermath and gives itself the credit, or blames itself for coldness. But neither interpretation is accurate. The more precise statement is that the self has withdrawn authorization from a persona structure that could no longer carry your life without falsifying it. By persona, I do not mean a mere social mask in the superficial sense. I mean the patterned form through which you were recognized and through which you recognized yourself, the one who remains available, the one who can be reached through guilt, the one whose empathy can be summoned as labor, the one who makes unbearable situations bearable by metabolizing what others cannot bear in themselves. Such a persona often forms not out of vanity, but out of necessity. In many lives it begins very early. The child learns that attunement secures temporary safety. The child learns to read facial weather, tonal shifts, timing anomalies. withheld speech, and the moral temperature of rooms. The child learns that love and danger may arrive in the same voice. Later, this appears as exceptional empathy, but beneath the gift, there is a complex, a survival intelligence organized around anticipation and repair. In time, if development proceeds, the psyche can no longer endure the cost of this arrangement, not because empathy is false, but because empathy fused with adaptation becomes self-erasure. The unconscious then begins to compensate. It does so first in symptoms the ego misreads. You call it numbness. You call it loss of motivation. You call it burnout. You call it not feeling like yourself. In truth, you are beginning to feel what you were not permitted to feel while the old role was in force, the weight of continual self-violation, the exhaustion of perpetual interpretation, the grief of being loved through function. What you call emptiness is often the space left when the compensatory machinery stops. At this threshold, the symbolic life becomes especially important because the dream often knows before the waking mind admits what has ended. I will describe one form this may take. You dream of a long corridor in a house you somehow know is yours, though you have never seen it before. The corridor is narrow, lit by winter light from a high window, and on one side there are several doors. In the dream you are not frantic. You are simply walking. Behind one door someone is speaking your name, not loudly, but insistently, as if they have been calling for a long time. You do not open it, not because you are afraid, and not because you hate the voice. You simply continue down the corridor. At the end there is a small table with a sealed letter on it. Your name is not written on the letter. No one's name is written on it. You stand there looking at it until you wake. This dream is not decoration. It is a map. The corridor is the newly conscious interval between stimulus and response. The doors are former access points. The voice is the old demand entering through intimacy. The sealed letter is meaning not yet opened by the ego. It belongs to you, but not to your former name. If you enter this period and do not understand its psychology, you may become frightened by your own steadiness. You may think, because you no longer react as before, that you have become less loving or less human. But the opposite is often true. What has diminished is not feeling but compulsion. In the old arrangement, your feelings were always already in service. They moved outward before they were allowed to become yours. In the new arrangement, feeling remains inside long enough to take form. This delay is experienced by others as distance because they were accustomed to immediate access. Yet, inwardly, it is the first sign of psychic sovereignty. Sophia, in this context, does not mean a sentimental feminine ideal, nor a spiritual ornament. It names a stage of integration in which insight ceases to be merely interpretive and becomes structural. You no longer merely understand patterns. You can no longer inhabit them in the old way. You no longer merely recognize projection. You cease to offer yourself as a screen. You no longer merely speak of boundaries. Your psyche ceases to produce the previous openings. This is why letting go is no longer a choice. The relation between knowledge and action has changed. The old split, seeing clearly and still complying, begins to close. Observe, then, what happens in the social field around you during this reorganization. One person becomes nostalgic. They invoke your former self with unusual tenderness. Not because they miss you in your totality, but because they miss a version of you that made their own inner life easier to avoid. Another person becomes morally indignant. They speak as though your new silence were a betrayal of shared values. This often occurs when your goodness had been used as a fixed point around which their own contradictions could rotate without consequence. Another becomes increasingly helpful, but the help carries surveillance. They wish to restore proximity under the guise of care. Another grows vague and disappears, because without your former emotional labor, there is no psychic profit in remaining near. What you must see, though not as advice, only as recognition, is that these reactions are revelations. They expose the unconscious terms by which you were previously held. Most relationships contain some measure of mutual use. This is human and not always malicious. But when individuation deepens, hidden economies become visible because your participation in them ceases. You begin to feel, with painful clarity, where you were loved as person and where you were retained as function. This is one of the colder graces of the Sophia Stage. It clarifies not by argument, but by withdrawal of supply, and still the ego often resists naming what has happened, because there is guilt. The old complex survives for a time as a moral echo. It says, if they are distressed, you must explain. If they misunderstand, you must clarify. If they accuse, you must repair the image. If they panic, you must soothe. This echo can persist long after the structure has broken. But now something else stands in the room with it, something quieter and more final. It is not a counter-argument, it is a fact of being. The body does not move toward the old task. The words do not arrange themselves. The inner hand remains open. This is the beginning of a very particular solitude, not the dramatic solitude of rejection, but the unspectacular solitude of no longer being continuously entered. Many people fear this stage because they imagine it will feel triumphant or tragic. And it feels like neither. It feels plain, a plainness so unfamiliar that it can seem unreal. You sit in a room after a difficult exchange and discover there is no inner trial, no rehearsed defense, no retrospective self-attack, no compulsion to send one more message that will finally make the invisible visible. There is only the room, a chair, a certain quality of light, your own breath, no longer subordinated to another person's weather. To the uninitiated psyche, this can feel empty. To a psyche entering integration, it is the first inhabitable space. A second dream often appears around this period, and it usually carries the image of a key that no longer works. You stand before an old door, sometimes a childhood room, sometimes a former home, sometimes a place you know in the dream belongs to a relationship. In your hand is a key you have used many times. You insert it, it turns halfway and stops. You do not force it. There is no panic. Then you notice, perhaps on the floor nearby, a broken key already rusting, as though someone had tried before and left it there. You wake with an unusual calm. This dream reveals two things at once. First, that the old method of entry is finished. Second, that the psyche has no wish to restore it. The broken key is not failure. It is an obsolete instrument. The dream does not ask you to find another key. It asks you to register that the house to which that key belonged is no longer the center of your life. In waking reality, this appears as a change in language, even when you say very little. You stop speaking from the old explanatory center. Your sentences become shorter, not because you have less to say, but because less is being spent in self-justification. You answer what is asked, not what is implied. You decline to interpret hidden accusations as invitations to intimacy. You no longer convert pressure into dialogue, and because so much of ordinary relating depends on unconscious overreach, this new precision can be experienced by others as coldness. In fact, it is often the first form of honesty that does not require self-abandonment. There is danger here, but not the sentimental danger people imagine. The danger is not that you will become cruel. The greater danger is that you will misread your own transformation and try to reverse it in order to restore familiarity. You may be tempted to re-enter old patterns just to feel contact, to reopen the former doors because the silence of your own house feels too stark. But the psyche in this stage often refuses such regression. That refusal can feel like incapacity. Again, you call it numbness. Yet what you are meeting is the irreversible element in development, a level of seeing after which participation in certain illusions becomes psychically expensive. This is why those around you often escalate before they adapt. The system senses the loss before the individuals understand it. There may be sudden crises, sudden confessions, sudden moral speeches, sudden tenderness, sudden reminders of your former role. The outer drama is an attempt at restoration. But if the Sophia movement has genuinely begun, you do not meet this drama with counter-drama. You remain where you are. The corridor remains a corridor. The doors remain closed unless there is a real person on the other side, not merely a demand. By this point, what has changed in you is already too deep to be described as preference. The old emotional contract has been seen, and seeing at this level is an event. It rearranges value, it alters timing, it changes what your nervous system recognizes as necessary, it strips moral glamour from self-erasure, it gives your silence weight, and because it has happened beneath the ego's theater of decision, you can no longer honestly say that you are choosing to let go. The more exact statement is more severe than choice, and much less dramatic. The inner structure that once made holding on possible is no longer in operation. What follows from this is not peace, at least not immediately, but exposure. When the old structure ceases, you begin to see not only others more clearly, but the hidden arrangement of your own goodness. This is one of the most uncomfortable recognitions in a serious psychological life, that what you called devotion may have contained fear, that what you called patience may have contained self-cancellation, that what you called loyalty may have contained an unconscious bargain against abandonment. I do not say this to reduce your love to pathology. I say it because the psyche becomes exact in this stage, and exactness is often experienced as cruelty before it is recognized as truth. You may notice this in a room full of people before you notice it in intimate relationships. There is a conversation moving around the table, and one of the familiar currents appears to drift toward emotional management, the subtle distribution of roles, the unspoken expectation that you will absorb tension and convert it into coherence. Once you would have entered almost immediately. You would have read the glances, softened the edge, made a joke at the correct moment, translated one person to another, protected the fragile vanity, concealed the violence in the phrase that did not mean anything by it. You would have done this so quickly that no one, perhaps not even you, would have known labor was taking place. Now you sit there and watch the current pass without stepping into it. The conversation grows awkward for a moment. Someone looks at you as if waiting for a tool that has not been handed over. The room reveals itself. This is a form of knowledge that cannot be gained through theory. One may study projection, persona, transference, and the nature of complexes for many years and still miss the psychological fact that the social world often organizes itself around those who can be unconsciously used as emotional infrastructure. You are beginning to feel what happens when that infrastructure is removed. What appears at first is not authenticity in a noble form. What appears first is disorganization. The hidden dependency surfaces, the pieties thin out, the moral language becomes sharper and less sincere. People speak of care while attempting access. They speak of concern while attempting restoration of control. They speak of honesty while punishing your refusal to return to emotional readability. This is why the Sophia movement is so often misinterpreted by others as pride. They cannot imagine a withdrawal that is not superiority because the old contract trained them to experience your openness as available territory. When the territory closes, they need an explanation that preserves their world. Pride, selfishness, coldness, bitterness. These names are often less descriptions of you than defenses against the fact that the previous arrangement is no longer consented to. In a psychological sense, they are naming the wound to their expectation. You also may briefly name yourself this way. The old moral reflex does not disappear in one movement. It returns as a voice, and its tone is very familiar. It says, perhaps you are becoming what hurt you. Perhaps this restraint is actually punishment. Perhaps this clarity is merely contempt. It is important to understand the source of this voice. It is not the self correcting you. It is the surviving echo of a complex whose function was to keep you permeable at any cost. Such complexes often borrow the language of conscience. They are persuasive because they speak in moral accents. Yet, if you listen carefully, they do not ask for truth. They ask for re-entry into the old role. The difference becomes visible in your body before it becomes clear in thought. When the old voice urges you to explain one more time, to reopen a closed exchange, to pursue someone who has already chosen distance, to soothe an accusation that was designed to bind rather than understand, your body gives no assent. There is no movement toward speech. There may be sorrow, there may be grief, there may even be tenderness, but there is no compliance. This is a crucial distinction. In the earlier structure, feeling and compliance were fused. To feel was to move toward repair. Now, feeling and action separate. You can feel deeply without reopening the old pattern. That separation is not indifference. It is integration. This is where one must speak of shadow, but not in the inflated way it is often used. The shadow in your case is not merely anger waiting to be expressed. It is the entire field of denied recognition, the resentment you concealed in order to remain kind, the disgust you censored in order to remain fair, the fatigue you translated into patience, the truth you swallowed because it would have endangered belonging. For a long period, the persona of the good, Understanding, stabilizing one, was maintained by placing these perceptions in shadow. They did not vanish, they remained active in the unconscious and demanded compensation. You felt this compensation as heaviness, confusion, strange paralysis, unexplained loss of vitality. It was not simply burnout. It was the cost of carrying too much unadmitted truth. When the Sophia stage begins, the shadow does not erupt theatrically. More often, it enters consciousness as structural sobriety. You begin to admit what you have known for years without permitting it to organize your life. You admit, for example, that some forms of tenderness around you were methods of access. You admit that certain apologies functioned as lubricants for repetition rather than signs of transformation. You admit that your over-explanation did not create understanding in people who profited from misunderstanding you. You admit that being needed is not the same as being loved. These are not dramatic realizations. They are cold recognitions, and they alter your participation more than any emotional climax. There is usually a relational arena in which this change becomes unmistakable. It may be family, where the oldest contracts are written. It may be partnership, where intimacy has often been confused with uninterrupted access. It may be friendship, where your role as interpreter and emotional witness became so consistent that it passed for your identity. Or it may be work, where competence and psychological sensitivity made you the one who absorbed disorder without acknowledgement. Wherever it occurs, the signs are the same. The old forms of leverage fail, and the social environment reacts as if a hidden utility has broken. In families, this often appears through timing. Someone reaches out not when there is mutual curiosity, but when there is pressure in their life and they need the old version of your responsiveness. The message contains a familiar blend of closeness and entitlement. Perhaps there is affection in it, perhaps nostalgia, perhaps a tiny accusation folded into concern. Once, this combination would have activated the entire complex. You would feel the old staircase inside yourself, the quick descent into responsibility, the rehearsal of what to say, the anticipatory guilt if you delayed. Now the staircase remains, but you do not descend. You stand at the top and look down. The architecture is visible. This image matters, the staircase. It is one of the central symbols of this phase because it represents the old vertical movement into the lower chambers of role and reflex. In earlier years, you moved down without seeing it. Now you can remain where you are and observe the invitation without entering the level where you once lost yourself. At times, the dream life will repeat this symbolism to confirm what waking consciousness still questions. You dream of a staircase in an old house. The lower floor is lit and noisy. You hear familiar voices calling upward, some affectionate, some irritated, some pleading. You are not trapped. You are standing on the landing with one hand on the rail. Behind you, there is another room, quiet, almost empty, with a chair by a window. The dream's pressure is subtle. The old voices assume you will come down, but in the dream you turn, not dramatically, and go into the quiet room. You sit in the chair. When you wake, there may be grief in the chest, but there is also a strange solidity. The dream is showing you a psychic fact already in place. The center of gravity has moved upward and inward. The lower floor has not disappeared, but it is no longer sovereign. You may ask, Inwardly, if not aloud, why this movement feels so irreversible. Why can one no longer simply be understanding in the old way and keep the peace? The answer lies in the relation between consciousness and symbol. Once an unconscious pattern has become symbolically visible, once you have seen the corridor, the sealed letter, the broken key, the staircase, the closed rooms, your participation in that pattern changes in kind. You may still enact fragments of it, but you can no longer do so innocently. The psyche now experiences regression as conscious falsification. This is why re-entering old roles feels not only tiring but degrading. It is not because the role was evil, it is because you now know what it costs and what it conceals. In this phase, another recurring symbol often appears: the mirror, but not as vanity. It may come in waking life as a brief perception. You pass a mirror and notice your face is quieter than before, less arranged, less explanatory. Or it may appear in a dream. You stand before a mirror in a dim room, and at first the glass shows nothing, only winter light. Then your face appears, but older in expression, not in age. There is no drama in it, no accusation, no smile, only a face that is no longer asking permission to exist. This image can disturb the ego because it does not confirm the old moral identity. It does not look good in the sentimental sense. It looks exact. The mirror in this stage reflects not your mood, but your reorganization. It reveals a person who is no longer governed by the need to be recognized as harmless. That, too, is part of the shadow's integration. Many psychologically adaptive people build a life around being impossible to accuse. They become preemptively reasonable, preemptively soft, preemptively transparent. This is not hypocrisy, it is protection. If one has known environments where accusation carried danger, one learns to stay ahead of it through over-clarity and emotional service. But this creates a profound vulnerability. Your conscience can be externally manipulated through image threat. Others need not understand you. They need only imply that you have been unfair, and the old machinery begins at once. In the Sophia stage, this vulnerability narrows, not because conscience disappears, but because image and conscience separate. You no longer mistake being misunderstood for being guilty. This is one of the points at which others may become genuinely alarmed, especially those who unconsciously relied on your guilt access. Their familiar methods no longer yield the previous movement in you. They sharpen the moral language. They invoke your history. They invoke what you used to be. They may even praise your empathy in order to reactivate it. This produces a very specific atmosphere, a strange politeness with pressure underneath. As though the conversation were standing on a hidden trapdoor, you feel it immediately. You hear not only the words but the old contract attempting to reconstitute itself. In earlier phases of life, your psychological skill often expressed itself as interpretation. You could tell who was wounded, who was acting from fear, who was split off from their own shame, who was unconsciously repeating a family pattern. That capacity does not disappear. What changes is what you do with it. You no longer automatically convert understanding into accommodation. This is one of the defining marks of integration, and one of the reasons it is so disturbing to others. They were accustomed to your insight as service. Now your insight remains with you as knowledge. It no longer functions as free labor in the relational field. This can create an uncanny social response. People may feel seen by you and simultaneously abandoned by you. They sense your understanding has not diminished, which makes your non-participation more difficult for them to bear. If you were merely cold, they could dismiss you. If you were merely angry, they could wait for the weather to pass. But when you are precise, calm, and no longer available for the old emotional economy, they experience a form of psychological mirror. Their strategies become visible to themselves through their failure. This is why some become hostile. The hostility is often a defense against self-recognition. There is no need here to moralize against them. Many of these patterns are inherited, unconscious, and widely shared. People use each other's structures because they do not know their own. They seek regulation where they can find it. They repeat what once stabilized them. But individuation has a ruthless dimension. It interrupts forms of mutual adaptation that depend on self-betrayal. What once looked like harmony is exposed as management. What once looked like closeness is exposed as access. What once looked like your virtue is exposed, in part, as your survival form. And so, the emotional temperature of your life changes. It does not become warm in the conventional way. It becomes clear. Clarity can feel cold because it stops feeding ambiguity. You begin to experience long stretches without the old agitation. In those stretches, grief may surface, not only grief for what others did, but grief for how long your own life was organized around being entered. This grief is not a call to restore the former arrangement. It is the mourning that accompanies reclassification. You are not only losing people on roles and expectations. You are losing a moral image of yourself that was built around availability. The psyche often marks this mourning through ordinary domestic details. You put a cup down in the kitchen and notice the silence is not empty. You sit in a chair in late afternoon and feel no need to send the message you once would have sent. You hear your phone in another room and do not rise. The light on the wall shifts toward evening. Nothing happens. Yet inwardly, an epoch is ending. These moments matter because they are where integration leaves the abstract and becomes lived time. The old compulsion used to govern these exact intervals. Now the intervals belong to you. If one were to name the mechanism beneath all this in Jungian terms, one would say that the axis of organization is shifting from persona complex adaptation toward relation with the self. But this sentence is too clean unless one also says what it feels like. It feels like losing appetite for what once kept you socially coherent. It feels like becoming unreadable to those who only knew your functions. It feels like a house in which certain doors are now permanently closed, not locked in anger, simply no longer built for passage. It feels like standing before an old mirror and recognizing that the person looking back is not more defended, but less divisible. The social world seldom forgives a change it did not witness being earned. It can tolerate your suffering because suffering confirms continuity. It knows how to place you when you are still legible through pain. It can even tolerate your temporary anger because anger still binds you to the field and promises a later return to the old arrangement. What it cannot easily tolerate is your quiet reclassification of what is no longer yours to carry. There is no spectacle in this, and therefore no ceremony by which others can admit what has changed. They continue to approach you by habit. They continue to speak to the former architecture, They continue to test the old doors. This is where the phenomenon becomes almost clinical in its precision. One person will try concern, another will try urgency, another will try nostalgia, another will try the moral language of fairness, another will try injury, another will try admiration. In earlier years, these entrances did not appear to you as entrances, they appeared as reality itself. You believed each emotional atmosphere as it arrived. You felt responsible for what was stirred in others by your delay, your boundary, your silence, your refusal to decode and rescue. But now the sequence is visible. You can watch the attempts pass through their order. This visibility is one of the signatures of the Sophia Stage. The pattern does not merely hurt less, it becomes readable as pattern. At this point, many people around you begin to experience you as different in ways they cannot describe. They may say you feel distant, but what they mean is that they can no longer move your interior with the same instruments. They may say you are colder, but what they mean is that your emotional field is no longer externally governed. They may say you have become private, secretive. Withholding. These accusations often arise in those who once mistook access for intimacy. To them, your opacity now feels like removal of love because they do not know another form of relation than penetration. They cannot yet imagine a bond that does not require immediate entry. A mature psychology must be exact here. You are not becoming invulnerable. You are becoming less accessible to misuse. This distinction matters because the ego, when threatened, likes grand interpretations. It wants to say, I need no one. I am beyond this. I have outgrown them all. Such thoughts are often a compensatory inflation and, if followed, they lead to sterility. The actual movement is more restrained. You still feel, you still register longing, disappointment, tenderness, grief, but these no longer compel self-abandonment. The emotion remains yours while it moves. It does not instantly become a corridor through which someone else enters. This is one of the deepest consequences of integration. Affect returns to ownership. If we speak in Jungian terms, one could say the transference field is changing. You no longer unconsciously offer yourself as the symbolic parent, confessor, regulator, redeemer, or witness in quite the same automatic way. Others still attempt to place you in these roles because psychic systems seek continuity, but the fit fails. The old transferential hooks strike a surface that is no longer organized around them. This creates a peculiar discomfort in the relational space. The other person may become more dramatic or more delicate, alternating between aggression and carefulness because they sense both your perception and your non-compliance. They feel watched by a person who is no longer available to be arranged. There is often one relationship in which this becomes unmistakable, and in that relationship, a single conversation that reveals the entire mechanism, not because the words are extraordinary, but because the timing is exact. A message comes late, after distance, after prior disregard, after some event in their life has produced pressure. The tone carries a blend of familiarity and need. Perhaps they mention your silence. Perhaps they imply hurt. Perhaps they speak in a way that assumes your emotional attention is already theirs. You read it and feel almost simultaneously two realities. One is the old pathway, still intact as memory. The other is the new fact, which is that the pathway no longer activates movement. You do not become cruel. You do not become righteous. You simply do not enter. This not entering is the completed event. The ordinary mind calls this detachment. The deeper psyche knows it as the end of unconscious contract. An unconscious contract is not written in words. It is composed of repeated exchanges, emotional timing, assumed duties, and compensatory roles. It says, without saying, I will remain available to your disorder if I can preserve belonging. I will absorb what is unprocessed in you if I can maintain moral position. I will translate your contradictions if I can avoid your withdrawal. Such contracts are often mutual, but not symmetrical. In your case, the asymmetry may have been hidden by your talent, because you were able to carry more. Others assumed you should. Capacity became obligation. Sensitivity became assigned function. Conscience became an access point. When the Sophia stage opens, this contract is not renegotiated. It is exposed, and exposure itself destroys it. One cannot unknow the price after seeing the structure. The persona that upheld the agreement, the one who interpreted, softened, and remained perpetually interruptible, loses symbolic authority. The ego may still imitate it from habit, but the psyche no longer supports the imitation for long. This creates a period in which you may appear inconsistent to others. Sometimes you answer, sometimes you fall silent, sometimes you remain warm but inaccessible, sometimes you are present in body but no longer performing your old role. Others read this as instability. In truth, they are observing the last friction between habit and reorganization. This friction often produces dreams of thresholds. The unconscious, when a major reclassification is occurring, returns repeatedly to doorways, corridors, windows, stairs, and rooms not yet occupied. I will name another dream that frequently accompanies this phase. You are in a large house, but this time you are not in the corridor. You are standing in a room with an empty chair near a window. Outside the window there is winter light on a garden path. The room is quiet, almost bare. A door behind you opens and someone enters. Not as a clear person, but as a familiar presence. They begin to speak, perhaps accusing, perhaps pleading, perhaps simply speaking as though the room still belongs to the old life. You do not argue, you do not answer, you look at the empty chair. The presence continues, but in the dream the voice begins to sound farther away, as if the room itself is changing its acoustics. Then you wake. This dream is exact in its symbolism. The empty chair is the former role waiting to be reoccupied. The room is your interior after withdrawal of old functions. The winter light is consciousness without emotional ornament. The changing acoustics signify what has completed. The old voice can still speak, but it no longer carries the same psychic force. The symbol of the empty chair deserves attention. In ordinary life, an empty chair can mean loneliness. In this stage, it often means vacancy of function. A place once occupied by your old persona remains visible but uninhabited. Others may continue speaking to that absence for some time. They address the old role because they do not yet know the person who remains when the role is gone. You, too, may grieve that chair. It may have given you dignity, purpose, even identity. To be needed in that way can feel like meaning, yet the psyche now refuses to let meaning be built on continual self-expenditure. This is why the social consequences of the Sophia stage are rarely dramatic in one blow. They unfold as a series of failed assumptions. Someone expects quick reassurance and receives stillness. Someone expects guilt and receives no argument. Someone expects over-explanation and receives one clear sentence. Someone expects access through crisis and finds that crisis no longer opens your inner house. These are the moments in which power changes. Though I use that word cautiously, the former power others held did not usually depend on brute force. It depended on your predictability. They could reach your conscience through certain cues. They could produce your labor through timing, tone, and implication. Once your predictability is no longer organized around adaptation, that form of relational power collapses. It is important not to romanticize this collapse. It does not feel triumphant. Often it feels like loss, because you begin to see how much of your life was structured by anticipatory participation. You realize you were often in conversation before anyone spoke, already preparing yourself to absorb, translate, and maintain. To stop doing this is to encounter a strange silence in your own mind. Many misread this silence as emptiness or depression. In some cases, there may indeed be depression intertwined with the process. But psychologically, one must distinguish them. Depression deadens meaning. This silence reveals where borrowed meaning used to be. There is also a moral consequence here that deserves exact language. When the old contract collapses, some people around you will feel abandoned, and in a simple emotional sense their feeling is real. They did lose something, but what they lost was not necessarily love. Often they lost unexamined access. They lost a reliable conversion system in which your empathy transformed their unprocessed material into tolerable relationship. They lost a particular arrangement of asymmetry. If they cannot grieve that honestly, they may accuse you instead. If they can, a different relation may eventually become possible. But the Sophia stage does not begin with mutual maturity. It begins with exposure. In this phase, the psyche frequently produces images of animals in dreams, and the animal often marks instinct returning to rightful place. An especially common figure is a dog, but not the sentimental domestic dog of companionship. Rather, a quiet animal sitting near a closed door, watchful but not agitated. You may dream of entering a dim hallway and seeing this dog lying before a door you once used constantly. It lifts its head and looks at you. It does not growl. It does not move aside. It simply remains there. You understand in the dream that the door is not to be used. The dog is instinct, no longer split off, and no longer in service of social adaptation. It guards not against others, but against your own regression into the former passage. When this instinct returns, boundaries cease to be moral performances and become architecture. You do not assert the boundary each time. You find that the psyche no longer permits certain movements. This is what I mean when I say the shadow becomes structure. In earlier phases, anger might appear only after repeated violation and then be immediately moralized away. You felt the anger, but translated it into understanding before it could organize action. In integration, anger is no longer primarily an emotion. It becomes form. It appears as timing, as distance, as a closed door, as a sentence not spoken, as a response not sent, as a room no longer entered. Others may say, "You are angry," because they can sense the loss of access, but what they are sensing is often not heat. It is shape, the old self, built around empathy and adaptation, often feared shape. Shape looked like cruelty, because shape says no without explanation. Shape does not soften itself for consumption. Shape allows misunderstanding. For a person whose childhood or early bonds depended on preventing rupture, this can feel morally dangerous. Yet individuation requires exactly this danger. The danger of no longer organizing your life around the avoidance of others' discomfort. If this is not accepted, one remains psychically divided, clear in insight, but still ruled by old obligations. That division cannot sustain itself forever. The Sophia movement emerges when the split between what you see and what you do becomes intolerable. You may have lived for years in that split, speaking of truth while living against it, understanding patterns while continuing to feed them, naming manipulation while still responding to its cues. The psyche can endure such contradiction for a long time, but eventually it exacts a price: depletion, confusion, loss of eros, inner deadness, a sense that life is happening through you but not from you. These symptoms are often treated as a motivation problem. In depth psychology, they are frequently signs that too much psychic energy is bound in a persona that can no longer serve development. As the energy withdraws, your life acquires a different emotional climate. Some people disappear because there is no longer an unconscious yield in you. Some stay but become formal because they are learning a new relation and do not yet trust it. Some grow more honest because your non-compliance leaves them no room for the old strategies. Some become adversarial because your opacity forces them into contact with themselves. You may grieve all of this. You may feel at moments that you have become difficult to love. This is a transitional sorrow and should not be sentimentalized. What is difficult now is not loving you. What is difficult is accessing you through your former fragmentation. There is another consequence, quieter and more decisive. Your relation to your own inner speech changes. The continuous self-explanation begins to diminish. You no longer narrate yourself in defense before an imaginary tribunal. You no longer conduct internal hearings about whether your silence was justified, whether your delay was kind enough, whether your unavailability can be morally excused. The tribunal loses authority. This is one of the least visible and most profound signs of integration. A person may look, from the outside, merely more reserved, but inwardly an entire court has closed. When that court closes, memory itself reorganizes. You begin to remember old scenes differently, not because facts change, but because your point of view is no longer located inside the role. Events you once interpreted as your failures reveal themselves as moments of coerced adaptation. Apologies you once cherished reveal their function as recurrence management. Crises you once rushed to contain reveal themselves as repeated summonses to your old position. This retrospective clarity can be painful. It can also tempt the ego into bitterness. But bitterness is not the center of this phase. exactness is. The Sophia stage is not revenge upon your past. It is the removal of false centrality. Your old role was never your essence. It was a brilliant adaptation, morally adorned and socially reinforced. But it was not the organizing truth of your life. As that role loses authority, the self does not announce itself with spectacle. It appears as proportion. You begin to feel what is yours and what is not. You begin to recognize where relation ends and appropriation begins. You begin to inhabit your own timing. You begin to allow a question to remain unanswered when the question is merely a demand-wearing language. And because the social field is built so heavily on unspoken contracts, this proportion can seem severe. Yet severity is often just the appearance of form to a world accustomed to permeability. The world may call it distance. The psyche knows it as coherence. You begin to discover, in a way that no theory can replace, that coherence has a sound. It is not loud. It is not the triumphant voice of someone who has found themselves. It is quieter than that, and far more unsettling. It is the absence of inner scrambling when old pressures arrive. A message comes with urgency in it, and your mind does not break into fragments. A familiar tone enters the room, half concern and half command, and your body does not descend the old staircase. A face hardens in front of you because your response did not contain the expected apology, and you do not feel the immediate need to make your own existence understandable. Coherence, in this stage, is not confidence, it is non-division. This is why the final movement of this psychological event cannot be described as healing in the ordinary language. Healing implies a restoration of what was injured. What is happening here is more exact and less sentimental. A prior organization of your life has lost legitimacy. The center that once governed your behavior adaptation through readability, belonging through self-interruption, contact through emotional labor, has ceased to function as law. The psyche may still remember it, and others may still appeal to it, but it no longer rules. By now you will have seen how the social field responds when this law collapses. The responses are patterned, and because they are patterned, they reveal the hidden terms of your former bonds. Someone intensifies their kindness exactly where they used to intensify pressure. Someone invokes honesty at the very moment your silence prevents their access. Someone stages confusion because confusion once drew your explanatory labor out of you. Someone becomes exquisitely polite because they can no longer presume entry. Someone drifts away without conflict because the old utility is gone. Each reaction says the same thing in a different costume. The former contract is no longer active. If one looks only outwardly, one might conclude that you have become less relational inwardly. However, something else has occurred. The psyche has stopped confusing merger with intimacy. This is one of the deepest shifts in individuation, and one of the least publicly understood. Many people call closeness what is in fact uninterrupted access. They call love what is in fact mutual regulation. They call loyalty what is in fact fear of rupture. These confusions can sustain entire lives, families, partnerships, communities. They can even appear noble, but when the Sophia stage begins, those confusions become difficult to maintain because your participation in them grows symbolically impossible. The symbol field, at this point, often grows simpler. Earlier dreams may have been crowded, dramatic, full of chase and explanation. Now the images are bare: a corridor, a door, a staircase, a chair, winter light, a sealed letter, a dog before a threshold. This simplification is not a loss of richness, it is concentration. The unconscious is no longer trying to persuade you through drama, it is stating what has already happened. The images repeat because the fact is stable. Certain passages are closed, certain rooms are no longer occupied by the old persona, certain calls no longer summon movement. Instinct has returned to guard what consciousness would otherwise reopen from habit. Notice how little of this depends on mood. This is another reason the event is often misnamed. If it were merely a mood hurt, anger, fatigue, it would fluctuate, and the old structure would return as the mood lifted. But the mark of completion is precisely that the pattern does not return even when tenderness returns, even when guilt returns, even when loneliness returns. You may miss someone and still not reopen the former passage. You may understand them and still not enter the old role. You may grieve the bond and still not restore access. This is what makes the shift psychologically decisive. Emotion no longer overrules structure. That sentence is severe, and it should be. For many years, your life may have been organized in the opposite way. Structure was repeatedly overruled by emotion. You knew the pattern and still entered it because the feeling in the moment was stronger than the long truth. You saw the misuse and still explained because the immediate guilt outweighed the deeper cost. You recognized the asymmetry and still participated because the fear of distance was more vivid than the damage of compliance. In the Sophia stage, the order reverses, feeling remains, but it no longer governs against what is known. This is why letting go is no longer a choice. Choice belongs to the old era, when the ego still stood between insight and participation, negotiating with itself. Here, the negotiation has ended. There is often a final internal resistance before this is fully admitted. It appears as a fantasy of repair, not ordinary reconciliation, but a very specific fantasy that if the other person could only understand what has happened in you, then the old bond could be restored in a new form without cost. This fantasy is not foolish. It belongs to the moral intelligence in you that still seeks mutuality. But in many cases it is also the last movement of the old complex, because it imagines that accurate explanation can transform a structure whose basis was never understanding to begin with. It imagines that language can undo a contract built on function. In reality, what determines the future of a bond after this stage is not your explanation, but whether the relationship can survive without your former role. Some can, many cannot. Those that cannot often reveal their limit through repetition. They continue to approach you by old timing, old pressure, old implication, old entitlement. Even after your responses have changed, they hear your words but not your structure. They interpret your coherence as temporary and wait for the old openings to return. This waiting can continue for a long time. The emptiest conflicts often occur here, not because there is much to say, but because one side is still speaking to a person who no longer exists in the same form. This does not mean you become unreachable in all things. A common distortion of this stage is to imagine a person sealed off from life enclosed in a sterile independence. But the psychology is subtler. You remain reachable where there is real relation. You remain responsive where there is mutuality, proportion, and respect for interior timing. You may even become more available in such relations than before, because your energy is no longer consumed by management. What has closed is not contact but extraction. What has ended is not tenderness but automatic surrender of your psychic center. From the outside, however, these distinctions are hard to perceive. Most people experience another person through the degree to which they can move them. If they can no longer do so with familiar means, they conclude the person has become distant. In this sense, your very coherence becomes a mirror. It exposes the methods by which others knew themselves in relation to you. Some will turn away from that mirror, some will attack it, some will stand before it, confused, and slowly become more honest. The Sophia Stage does not decide this for them. It only removes the old disguise. There is also a private consequence that few speak of. As your inner court closes and your social role reclassifies, time itself changes. The day becomes longer in certain hours. There are intervals in which nothing presses inward. No anticipated text, no rehearsed response, no moral tribunal drafting a defense, no interior migration toward someone else's emotional weather. At first, this can feel like vacancy, even fear. You may pace a room and not know what to do with the unclaimed energy. This is not a problem to solve. It is the nervous system and psyche learning life without continual interruption by old contracts. In many people, this is the first time adult consciousness experiences uncolonized interior time. In such time, memory continues to reorder itself. You remember not only what was done to you, but what you kept doing to yourself in the name of virtue. This can produce shame, and one must be careful. Shame is often the final attempt of the old complex to keep itself central. It says, "How could you have lived this way for so long?" But this question, too, belongs to a false tribunal. The more exact question is what conditions made that adaptation necessary, and what psychic strength was hidden inside it all along. For the same sensitivity that trapped you in old contracts is also what now allows exact perception. The same conscience that made you reachable by guilt is also what now refuses false reconciliation. The same depth of feeling that once dissolved your structure is what now gives structure a soul. Integration does not discard these capacities. It releases them from servitude. This is why I say the Sophia movement is dangerous calm. It is dangerous not because it seeks domination, but because it withdraws unconscious consent. Entire relational systems depend on what you no longer provide automatically. Entire images of you depend on what no longer appears on demand. Entire moral narratives about love, family, loyalty, friendship, and care begin to thin when your life is no longer organized around proving them through self-expenditure. In this sense, your silence destabilizes more than conversations. It destabilizes the hidden theology of the relationships around you. And yet, if one remains exact, there is no heroism in this. There is cost, there is solitude. There is the plain grief of no longer being recognized through the role that once gave you place. There is the discomfort of allowing misunderstanding to stand where you once would have rushed to clarify. There is the ache of seeing who can relate to you only when you are divisible. There is also the quiet fact that some doors, once closed, will never be used again, not because of punishment, but because they open into rooms that no longer belong to your life. If we return, then, to the title, we can name it Psychology Without Melodrama. Letting go in this stage does not describe an act of will. It describes the end of a former organization of attachment. The ego may still narrate it as a decision because the ego needs a story in which it remains central. But the deeper truth is more impersonal. A developmental threshold has been crossed. Symbolically, the key has broken. The staircase is no longer descended. The empty chair remains unoccupied. The corridor doors no longer summon. The dog remains at the threshold, and the winter light falls on a room whose silence is now your own. What has completed inside you is not detachment, but the loss of your former availability to be organized by what is not yours. And because that completion is real, not imagined, the psyche now begins to show you the remaining fragments that still try to survive inside the old law. They are smaller than before, but they are not nothing. A passing urge to explain yourself when no explanation is being sought in good faith. A sudden tightening in the chest when someone uses the old, disappointed tone. A brief impulse to restore warmth too quickly because the atmosphere in the room has become strained. These are not failures. They are residues. The old structure no longer governs, but traces of it remain in the nervous system, in memory, in the body's learned anticipation of consequence. This is why the final movement of this stage is so quiet. Nothing dramatic needs to happen. What remains is simply seen, and because it is seen, it loses authority. There is a particular kind of encounter in this period that reveals the whole process with almost painful clarity. You are with someone who once knew exactly how to pull you into emotional labor. The methods were never openly named. They did not need to be. A pause at the right time, a sentence left unfinished, a sigh, a moral implication, an injured silence, an appeal to your history together, a remark that mixes accusation with intimacy. In the old structure, you would already be moving toward repair before the exchange had even fully formed. You would be internally arranging language, smoothing edges, making room for their contradiction, shrinking your own perception to preserve connection. Now the same gestures appear, but they strike a different interior. You recognize them as gestures. You do not need to accuse the person of manipulation. You do not need to interpret their motives. The psychology has become simpler than that. You see the method, and your life no longer organizes around answering it. This simplicity can be difficult for the ego because the ego prefers drama to finality. It wants conflict, closure, confession, reconciliation, scenes that can be remembered and narrated. But the psyche in a mature movement often refuses spectacle. It lets things end in ordinary lighting. A conversation finishes and you do not send the second message. A silence extends and you do not fill it. A misunderstanding stands and you do not convert it into a campaign for recognition. Someone withdraws and you do not chase their retreat with your autobiography. These moments feel almost too small to carry significance, and yet they are the exact places where the old world loses its continuity. There is also a colder recognition that emerges now, and it concerns kindness. You may discover that much of what you called kindness had become inseparable from fear of consequence. Not all of it, but enough to matter. You were kind in order not to rupture the bond, kind in order not to be misread, kind in order not to become the accused one, kind in order to preserve your image as the one who understands. This does not make your kindness false, it makes it burdened. In the Sophia Stage, kindness loses some of its moral glow and becomes more exact. It no longer means endless interpretive labor. It no longer means making yourself available to what repeatedly harms your structure. It no longer means preventing every discomfort in others that your coherence now causes. This change can look, from outside, like a loss of tenderness, but inwardly it is tenderness no longer in service of self-erasure. At this depth, the symbol of the sealed letter returns, and now its meaning becomes clearer. Earlier, the letter lay at the end of the corridor, unopened, unnamed. You could only stand before it. In many people, the dream changes here. You are again in the corridor, but it is wider now, less oppressive. The winter light is stronger. The doors on either side are closed, and no voices call. At the end, the same small table stands with the letter upon it. This time you pick it up, you still do not open it. The dream ends with the letter in your hand. This is the psyche's way of saying that what was once merely an unarticulated fact has become owned reality. Meaning is no longer somewhere at the end of withdrawal. Meaning has entered your possession even before language catches up. The letter remains sealed because this stage is not completed by explanation. There may never be a sentence that fully captures what has shifted. The ego wants a phrase to deliver to others, a polished summary, a moral justification, but the psyche often withholds this. It does not withhold out of confusion. It withholds because the event is structural, not rhetorical. It can be lived long before it can be spoken. This is another reason people around you become uneasy. Your life now contains a fact that does not present itself for debate. You may also notice how your relation to anger changes in its most refined form. Earlier I said anger becomes shape. Here one sees the consequence, the old idea of anger as heat, force, confrontation, righteous speech begins to feel secondary. The more consequential anger is now almost invisible. It is in what you do not permit to continue. It is in what no longer passes through you as normal. It is in the end of certain tones, certain assumptions, certain timings. It does not always speak. It alters the architecture and leaves the room standing. Others often miss this entirely and then wonder why access has disappeared. They search for the argument because argument can be negotiated. They cannot find it. They are standing before shape. This is why the social field may continue to produce strange scenes long after you yourself feel settled. Someone who ignored you becomes attentive. Someone who treated you casually becomes ceremonious. Someone who was often vague becomes suddenly explicit. Someone who relied on your patience calls you harsh. Someone who often withheld now complains that you are unavailable. These reversals are not ironies to enjoy. They are disclosures. The change in you has forced the relation to reveal its unconscious proportions. What each person does with that revelation belongs to their development, not yours. This is perhaps the hardest thing for the older persona to accept. It still wants to midwife everyone's process, to translate your change into something they can bear, to remain morally legible at all times. But the Sophia movement is exact in one of its sternest truths. Not every consequence of your coherence is yours to manage. There is often a final dream in this sequence, and it is usually simpler than all the others. No corridor, no house, no staircase, just a room, an empty chair, and a window with winter light. The dog may be there, asleep now near the door, no longer guarding with attention because guarding is no longer necessary. On a table lies the broken key. Beside it, the sealed letter. You are in the room, but you do not move toward any object. You stand or sit, and the dream ends. Such a dream is psychologically exact because nothing in it is asking to be solved. The symbols have ceased to behave like messages and become elements of a completed interior world. The key is no longer a problem. The chair is no longer loneliness. The dog is no longer vigilance. The letter is no longer suspense. The winter light is no longer barrenness. Everything remains, but under a different law. If one were to speak of individuation in a more public language, one might describe it as becoming oneself, but that phrase is too broad to be useful here. What has occurred in your case is narrower and more precise. You have not become yourself as a slogan. You have ceased to be available in the old way to what organized you through guilt, readability, and role. The result may eventually allow richer forms of relation, but that is not the center of this moment. The center is the completed withdrawal of unconscious permission. This withdrawal changes even your private fantasies. You may remember how often your mind once rehearsed future conversations in which you would finally be understood. Finally explain the pattern. Finally say what you meant in a form that could not be distorted. Those rehearsals begin to lose energy, not because your truth is less important, but because your psyche no longer depends on being properly received in order to remain coherent. This is a profound and often lonely freedom. A person who no longer needs to be understood in order to not betray themselves becomes difficult to control by misinterpretation. Many relational systems depend on the opposite. Misinterpretation, for a long time, may have functioned as a leash. Others did not need to command you directly. They needed only to imply that you were unfair, hard, distant, selfish, ungrateful, and the old machinery would activate. You would rush to clarify, repair, humanize, soften, contextualize. Your conscience was genuine, but it was also an access route. In this stage, the leash falls because image no longer governs conscience. You can be misunderstood and remain inwardly aligned. This does not make misunderstanding pleasant. It makes it survivable without self-division. One must also name what disappears along with the old contract, a certain kind of excitement. The nervous system, when long accustomed to volatility and emotional labor, can mistake activation for aliveness. The old relational dynamics may have exhausted you, but they also gave the psyche constant tasks, constant vigilance, constant meaning through management. When that stops, life may feel unusually flat for a time. This flatness is often misdiagnosed as loss of passion. In many cases, it is simply the absence of chronic stimulation. The soul is relearning scale. It is discovering what life feels like when not every silence is a threat and not every delay is a summons. In that relearning, smaller realities return. The texture of a room in late afternoon, the sound of your own footsteps without inner argument, the fact that your body can remain seated when discomfort enters a conversation, the plainness of not answering immediately, the relief of not drafting your defense in advance. These are not spiritual achievements. They are signs that psychic energy has withdrawn from obsolete arrangements and returned, however quietly, to presence. Presence, in this sense, is not warmth, not charisma, not emotional abundance. It is occupancy. You are in your life where before you were often stationed at its borders, monitoring entry, managing weather, translating impact, preparing response. Occupancy is one of the least glamorous and most decisive fruits of this stage. It has little to offer the social world that prefers performance, but it has everything to do with reality. For only what is occupied can be genuinely related from, the rest is function. And because occupancy is now possible, a final moral reversal occurs. You begin to see that what once looked like abandonment, your silence, your delay, your refusal to reopen certain exchanges, was in fact the first refusal to abandon yourself in the old way. This recognition is not sentimental. It does not turn your history into a heroic narrative. It simply removes a lie. The lie was that goodness required permeability without limit. The lie was that love required self-interruption as law. The lie was that conscience required you to remain emotionally readable to whoever demanded access. Those lies may have been woven into family structures, intimate bonds, even your own spiritual language. They no longer hold. If some relationships survive this stage, they do so because they begin, perhaps awkwardly, to meet the person who remains when the old role is gone. These relations feel different from the start. Less heat, more proportion, less extraction, more interval, fewer tests, more directness. They are not necessarily easier, but they do not depend on your fragmentation. If other relationships do not survive, the reason is not always cruelty. Sometimes they were built too deeply into the former architecture. They cannot continue because the passages they required no longer exist. This, too, is exactness. And so, the final movement of this lecture cannot offer reconciliation, nor warning, nor instruction. It can only name the fact with the precision this stage demands. The corridor remains, the doors remain, the staircase remains, the empty chair remains, the dog sleeps, the key is broken, the letter is in your hand. The winter light falls on a life no longer arranged around being entered. What ended was not attachment, it was your unconscious permission to be used as a passage.